Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 38. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Dmitri Alperovitch. You may remember Dmitri from episode 28. He is co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership in the 21st century and beyond. He is a co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike Incorporated, a leading cybersecurity company. Dmitri has served as special advisor at the Department of Defense and currently serves on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's Cyber Safety Review Board. Those are real government mouthfuls. He is the host and creator of Silverado's popular Geopolitics Decanted podcast. But today we're taking a deep dive into his newly released book titled World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Dmitri, welcome back to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Well, since last we talked, your book is coming soon to the streets, and we want to talk a little bit about what brought you into this crazy idea of writing a book to begin with. I talk with a number of authors who at the end of their journey say, I don't know why I ever did that, and I don't think I ever want to do that again. But maybe for you, this was just fish in water time. But what brought you to the point of writing any book? And then let's talk about this book.
No, this was definitely a very intense 2-year process that I'm just now coming out of having released this book, and certainly don't feel like I want to write another one anytime soon, for sure. But the book really started 2 years ago, right after the invasion of Ukraine. As you know, Steve, I was one of the early analysts that predicted that war would take place later that winter. I went on Twitter, as one does, in December of 2021 and laid out a long list of reasons for why I was becoming certain that Putin would invade Ukraine before the end of that winter. Unfortunately, that came to pass. And as I was thinking about those reasons in my analysis of Russia and what they were trying to do with Ukraine, I was struck by how all of those same reasons apply to the other region of the world with China and Taiwan. And I was getting more and more concerned that war in that other region, part of the world, was becoming more and more inevitable as well, not on the same time scale as Ukraine. I think we have some years before Xi Jinping is likely to go for Taiwan, but nevertheless, was very concerned about the preparedness of the Taiwanese, spend time on the island, and they're really not in a great shape to defend that island, unfortunately. And our own capabilities in the region have atrophied over the decades. We're trying to build them up significantly. And I thought about ways to try to ring the alarm bells about this future conflict. And then later on, I got this incredible email from a person I've never met, an out-of-the-blue email. This was a Ukrainian immigrant to the United Kingdom who told me that he had encountered my writings on the conflict before the war, became convinced by what I was saying, and pushed his family that was still in Ukraine, his parents and siblings, to try to leave the country. And initially, they resisted very hard. They said that this is all propaganda, that Russia is not planning any invasion. And he finally managed to convince them on February 15th, literally 9 days before the launch of that invasion, to leave the country. They lived on the outskirts of Kharkiv, a city in eastern Ukraine, and their neighborhood was very heavily shelled by the Russians. Some neighbors had perished. And he was basically thanking me for drawing his attention to this problem and ultimately pushing him to get his family out, potentially saving their lives. And I realized that, if I can have that tiny impact that I may have had in saving someone's life in Ukraine, that I had an obligation to try to raise the alarm bells as much as I can about a conflict that would be much more devastating and much more impactful to the United States if China goes for Taiwan, if we fight for Taiwan, that will change the world instantly. The casualties that we would experience are just unimaginable, would perhaps eclipse the daily casualties we suffered at any moment during World War II. The destruction to the world economy, perhaps of $10 trillion of economic value would be wiped out, and potentially could change the nature of American dominance and global power forever. If China succeeds in that effort. So it was important to both raise alarm bells and, most importantly, and the real reason I want to write the book is outline the strategy for winning, deterring
Right.
China from invading Taiwan, but winning the broader Cold War that we are engaged in with China.
Well, that is the nub of it. With some familiarity with the thesis of the book, I want to give you a chance to articulate some of the responses to the immediate conventional rebuttals that come up about, well, we had from the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War that China is very different from the USSR. And there's many China experts who've spent their entire careers explaining away the similarities. And somewhat similarly, you would have people who have a narrative about the Soviet Union during the first Cold War that isn't necessarily tracking with the reality of what American engagement was there. So before we get into the prescription part, which I'll leave for the meat of our discussion coming up, let's talk about knocking down some of these presumptive rebuttals about, well, you can't compare what happened with the Soviet Union or Russia invasions of Ukraine. China's just different.
Yeah. So not only do I compare, I go into great lengths to compare Cold War I history, and I actually put a lot of Cold War I history in the book to remind people and in some cases educate people about aspects of the Cold War that they may not be even aware of. And I got to tell you, in doing the research for the book, I was actually shocked, Steve, by the similarities between the two conflicts. I went into the book with full conviction that we're in a Cold War with China, but I assumed that there are a lot of differences between Cold War I, as I call it, and Cold War II. I was shocked how on almost every level, the conflict is literally almost exactly the same. And let me just run through you some of those reasons, right? First of all, unquestionably, I don't think anyone would even raise an eyebrow at this. We are in a global competition for supremacy, very similar to what the Soviet Union and America were engaged in. We're now facing with China and America. We're both preparing for war, right? As we speak, I was just in Hawaii a few months ago talking with folks in the Indo-PACOM command. They're preparing for this conflict. China is certainly building up capabilities in the region specifically for this invasion. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we saw some remarkable satellite pictures come out from open source satellite collection of a training camp in Inner Mongolia, the largest Chinese military training camp, where they had built a road network. That if you overlay that road network on the city of Taipei in Taiwan, the capital of Taiwan, it matches exactly. And what is at the center of that road network? The Taiwanese presidential palace, right? They're training for not just occupation of outlying islands or fighting a naval battle with Taiwan or U.S. forces. They're training for occupation of the center of power of Taiwan, right? They're training for they take over the government. They're training for a coup. You have an arms race. Both countries, the United States and China, are building up both conventional military capabilities, but also nuclear. In fact, China is modernizing their nuclear arsenal, going from about 300 warheads to 1,000, is estimated by the U.S. intelligence community by the end of the decade. Very, very similar to the first Cold War. We have a space race, right? One of the defining characteristics of the 1960s, the space race between America and the Soviet Union. You have this again with China, both countries racing to get to the moon, and then in the coming decade to Mars potentially, as well as more importantly from a national security perspective, occupy that critical real estate in low Earth orbit where you now have the future of satellite communications, satellite navigation, satellite intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We are way ahead thanks to innovations from SpaceX, thanks to Amazon's constellations, but China is trying to desperately keep up. You have economic warfare, both trade wars that started under President Trump, But really, Chinese economic warfare that they've been waging against us for decades, with stealing intellectual property, destroying our manufacturing base, engaging in unfair trade practices like dumping and overcapacity that they still doing to this day, forcing Western companies to do joint ventures in China and tech transfers, all the things that you know so much about as well. We have an ideological struggle. It's not necessarily communism versus capitalism like we had during the first Cold War. China is not necessarily a traditional capitalist Marxist society these days, but it's certainly authoritarianism versus democracy, and we're seeing that play out across the globe today. And we have a major regional flashpoint. For the first 15 years of the Cold War, we were on the precipice of a conflict with the Soviet Union, including potentially a nuclear one, because of a little piece of real estate called West Berlin that both Truman and then Eisenhower and later Kennedy basically declared would be defended at the cost of American lives and potentially even at a cost of a nuclear conflict. That real estate was that important. We're now facing the same issue in Taiwan. We have a scramble for military bases, right? We are once again building up military bases in the Indo-Pacific, in Japan, going back into the Philippines. The Chinese are doing the same thing in Pakistan and Cambodia, in Africa, in Djibouti, on the western side of Africa, on the eastern side of Africa. So very, very similar in every area. And perhaps one of the most defining features of the Cold War was the spy war, right? Massive amounts of espionage being conducted by both sides, but began with the Soviet Union, with the Manhattan Project, stealing the secrets to the nuclear bomb. Well, we have that being done to us from China on a scale hitherto unimaginable, enabled by cyber. I spent many, many years fighting Chinese espionage in domestic industry, in government networks. They're stealing everything that's not bolted down that the Soviet Union would wish they had the capability to do, right? Now, some people say, well, you have this economic interdependence that's happening with China that you didn't have in the Soviet Union. And the book actually debunked that argument quite thoroughly, because we had way more economic connections with the Soviet Union than most people realize. In fact, throughout the 20s and 30s, when the Soviet Union was very much focused on fighting America, fighting the United Kingdom, fighting the capitalist West in what they viewed, I cite the documents from that era, as an existential fight to the death. What do? We were telling American industrials, encouraging them to come to the Soviet Union and help build factories there. Sounds familiar? Do technology transfers. A couple of quick examples for you, Steve, that are so fascinating. The Volga limousines that were driven by the Soviet leadership on Red Square during their military parades to celebrate the October Bolshevik Revolution came out of a factory that was built by who? Henry Ford, who came over to the Soviet Union, built a tractor factory, later an automobile factory, and later nationalized by the Soviets to produce Volgas and other automobiles. Not on the same scale as China, obviously, but the trend lines are the same. Holt Caterpillar, now Caterpillar, came over and produced combiners in the Soviet Union to help them achieve independence in wheat production. That they later reverse engineered, kicked out Caterpillar, and started producing their own combiners. The same playbook that China, not pioneered, but copied and expanded to a great extent. And you could say, well, that was before we realized we were in a Cold War. Certainly afterwards, things were very different. No, they weren't. A couple of examples for you. 1946 and 47, the Soviets are trying to build their first jet fighter plane, the MiG-15, that would become the most produced jet fighter plane in the world, largely based on German designs that they had taken after World War II. And they're having problems with the engine. It's not reliable. It's not performant. And the trade minister at the time, who happens to be the brother of the constructor of the MiG plant, Mikoyan, Artem Mikoyan, the M and the MiG, goes to Stalin and says, I would like your permission to approach the British to license the Rolls-Royce engines to us for the MiG-15 fighter. Now, 46, 47, this is after Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. This is after we've instituted the National Security Act, creating the CIA, creating the National Security Council, sort of thinking we're fully in the Cold War, right? And Stalin's response is incredulous. He says, "What fool is going to sell you their secrets? This is insane." But no harm in trying. Give it a shot. They approached the British, the Labour government in Britain, who had beaten Churchill, of course, at the end of World War II. They're interested in a better relationship with the Soviet Union. More trade is good, right? Have you heard that before? Well, they sell them the Rolls-Royce engines. They adapt them for the MiG-15 fighter. And just a short 3 years later, those MiG-15s flown by North Korean pilots and later even Soviet pilots shoot down 160 American pilots over the fields of Korea, right? We armed them. And in the 60s and 70s, we're fully in the midst of the Cold War. This is after the Cuban Missile Crisis. A lot of our allies keep selling oil and gas technology to the Soviet Union that was used to produce fossil fuels or financing their arms race, financing the entire regime, right? There's just so many similarities between what was happening then and what is happening today with China. Scale is different, but that's about the only difference.
Well, as far as I know, you're the only person that I've talked to who's brought up this paradigm breaking notion that we had these areas of dependency in relative abundance going into and through the Cold War. And that's kind of a fact pattern that matters in terms of shaping what your assumptions were about that. The other part that I really think that your book, your work, your articulation of this really helps reset is the idea that, yeah, from the West, and especially we Americans, we have this missionary impulse that we want to believe that we can convert others. And maybe that is divine in some senses and something that's worthy to be hoped for. But as we pursue that yearning, the counterpart historically has continued with a comprehensive warfare approach where they'll take the benefits, they'll take our openness, and they will methodically build up over time to use it against us. And for sure, that is what has been happening with the People's Republic of China. I don't think very many Americans, though, have had that gap filled in, that we did the same thing with the Soviet Union, which is amazing since that's just part of history and it shouldn't even be partisan to pick at that anymore.
That's right. And by the way, many people sort of assume, those that are of our view, that we are in this conflict with China. Many people think, well, this is just a recent phenomena. This is just Xi Jinping being Xi Jinping. And if we didn't have him, if we had Hu Jintao or some of these prior leaders, that things would be much better. And I debunk that as well in the book, because even if you go back to Deng Xiaoping and his famous guidance to the Chinese people, hide your strength, bide your time. Well, the key question is, who are you hiding your strength from?
Right.
And what are you biding your time for? and there's not a lot of choices there, right? And in fact, Deng Xiaoping himself, just as we are opening up trade with China in 79 and into the early 80s, what is he doing? He is establishing a better relationship with the Soviet Union, right? Reversing the hostility that was characterizing the 60s and 70s. And in fact, saying, well, now that we have a better relationship with the Soviet Union, we need to focus on the real threat, which is the United States, because they're determined to snuff out communist regimes and socialist countries, regimes around the world. They are our dominant threat. Deng Xiaoping, while we are selling not just our goods and transferring our technology to China, we're selling military weapons throughout the 1980s, right?
Yeah.
We're selling Black Hawk helicopters that they promptly reverse engineered and built the Z-10 helicopters that are now presenting a significant problem for us in the Taiwan invasion scenario, and lots of other things. We stopped doing that after Tiananmen Square, but of course we kept everything else going. And they've been focused on this for years, right? This was always a dream, Mao's dream of taking Taiwan. It was never extinguished. It was only a question of time. And we're now facing a leader in Xi Jinping who wants to have this happen under his watch. And the time has come, in his view, to go after Taiwan. Again, not eminently. I think the real threat is 2028 through 2032 time frame, but it's 48 years away.
Well, I think that frame of reference you bring about the Chinese government of the late 1980s still having this interaction with Soviet leaders, actually, people forget the only reason we have so much video footage of the protests at Tiananmen Square and the crackdown at Tiananmen Square is because Gorbachev was visiting Beijing for a summit. And that is literal. Otherwise, we would have had very minimal coverage. We would have known something had happened, but the information warfare apparatus of China would have really kicked into hyperdrive, and we might not have even had the sanctions regimes of the early 1990s in response to all of that if it were not for the timing of that Sino-Soviet summit. So I mean, it's just part of that storyline that even I, thinking I was looking very closely at all this stuff, living through all of these things and having somewhat of a skeptical, perhaps hawkish view of things going through, even I didn't really have the feel for this. But now looking back, as you outline some of these things, it's painfully obvious as we look back. But so let's shift gears from the looking back and the reframing of the history we thought we knew. And now you've got this provocative thesis, which really shouldn't be provocative, but there is some resistance to it, that we're already in a Cold War, that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping, but others, had already been engaged in different forms of warfare against us. And we just have chosen not to see it. And our choice now is just whether and how to respond. Some people would kind of pull back and say, no, this isn't a Cold War. This is actually bigger than a Cold War. Okay, there's that side of the argument. But then there's others that would say, well, you just talking about a Cold War is sort of going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're just talking us into another conflict we don't have to have. I'm guessing that if not already, as you go on tour to talk about your book, you're going to get some versions of these things. But I am of the view that the actions have already taken us into whatever we want to call it. I think the Cold War framework is apt in the sense that it's comprehensive. And it is existential, at least in the sense that our civilization will not continue as we have come to know it if we don't respond. And so if we just accept that premise, let's start shifting into prescriptions. You have done the deep research. Some people would say, oh, this is too big. I feel overwhelmed. Let's just sue for peace. My guess is what you saw and learned by watching the experience with the Soviets and watching what's been happening with China, you're not going to be someone that says, let's just sue for peace and cut our losses now. What's our strategy to actually win? I'm deducing this from the title of your book.
Yeah. So first of all, let me be very clear. I'm not pro-war. I think war is hell. I think we want to avoid war, but the way you avoid war is peace through strength, right? And through deterrence, not through surrender. And there are three elements to the strategy for winning this Cold War with China. The first one, and most important one, starts with Taiwan and deterring an invasion of Taiwan. And it's important to describe to people why Taiwan matters, because a lot of people may think, what does this little speck of land 100 miles off the Chinese coast have to do with us, right? And yes, it would be bad for the Taiwanese people. They would lose their freedom and democracy, but, that happens around the world. In Ukraine, of course, the Russians are trying to snuff out democracy and freedom there, but, we're not fighting in Ukraine, and I don't think anyone in America really believes that we should be. So why are things different in Taiwan? And some people say, well, Taiwan matters to us because of chips, right? And some people have made the argument that as soon as we achieve independence on chips, then Taiwan will stop mattering to us. And I actually think that that's a very reductionist and frankly insulting comment about importance of Taiwan. First of all, on chips, as an aside, we're not getting independent of Taiwan on chips in any foreseeable future, right? The CHIPS Act, most people don't appreciate, is designed to stabilize the decline of American chips industry. It is not reversing it in any sense of the word, right? We today produce about 12% of the world's chips. If everything goes absolutely right, which is a big question mark, we might get to 20%, might be able to get to 20%, but there's no circumstance under which Taiwan for the coming decades is not producing the vast majority of advanced chips and probably a huge part of foundational chips as well. But that's not why we should care about Taiwan, because at the end of the day, fighting just for economics is frankly not the right strategy either. You're not going to convince a lot of people that they should lose their life or risk losing their life because of a chip that goes into your car, right? That's not a very mobilizing thing to decide to lose your life over. But Taiwan matters because it's that anchor point in the most critical parts of the world. And by the way, the reason that China wants Taiwan, there's obviously a historical element to it. There's the vision of destiny, that this is unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War, that they never really squashed the Chinese nationalists, the Chiang Kai-shek forces, because he was, of course, able to flee with 2 million of his supporters across the strait and establish himself on Taiwan. Not just establish himself, but establish a Republic of China, sort of an alternative China that was the China that the world recognized for the first 20 years or so after that, after that, the end of that civil war. But most importantly, it matters to them because of geography and because of security. If you're China, and I have this map in the book I rotate the map and I put China at the top of the map, looking out at the Western Pacific, what do you see? You see yourself completely contained and surrounded by U.S. military bases and U.S. allies, right? From the east, it starts with the Korean Peninsula, half of which, of course, is South Korea, with U.S. forces on that peninsula. Then continuing forward, you have the Japanese islands. Marines are in Okinawa and other places around the Pacific. You have the naval fleet that is based there, enormous American power on those islands. Then you have Taiwan, really at the center of that first island chain, facing straight at China, facing most of the Chinese ports, naval ports, and maritime shipping ports, and is viewed as an outpost, effectively, of American power. And further down, you see the Philippines, the Philippine Islands, that once again are getting closer to the United States, where we're once again building naval bases, right? So for China, that wants to be the preeminent power in the world, that wants to project power both in its region and worldwide, you can't have that happen, where at a whim of the United States Navy, we can essentially institute a full blockade of the Chinese military naval power, as well as their civilian shipping, right? And they view, by the way, themselves as the natural world leader that they have been for much of human civilization, right? They were the greatest, richest power for much of the last 2 millennia, and only since the Industrial Revolution did they get eclipsed by the Europeans and then later Americans. And they view this as just a natural revert back to the mean of course, they're the world's greatest power, right? And to allow themselves to be contained this way by America and its allies is completely unacceptable. And that's why they want Taiwan, because Taiwan would allow them to break out of that containment and dominate that entire region, push the U.S. Navy all the way back to Hawaii. That whole region would be basically completely unsafe for us, in a way that the South China Sea has become unsafe, as U.S. naval officials have said, that if we're in a conflict with China, we're getting the heck out of South China Sea, because they can sink our ships there with the radar installations that they've built and missiles, and it becomes very dangerous. Well, the exact same thing would happen to us in Western Pacific, right? And the Japanese would be very threatened, the Filipinos would be very threatened, the South Koreans. It would change the nature of that whole region. And as goes Asia, goes the world, right? This is a region with 50% of the world's GDP, most of the world's supply chains, most of the world's growth. So to allow China to dominate that region is not just, an inconvenience for us. It is existential, because it really means the end of American superpower. It means a reverting back to our borders and our own nation. And the world would no longer be safe for American troops. The world will no longer be safe for American trade, which is at the center of our power, really, right? You think about the rise of America. It starts with the 1900s, the projection of the U.S. Navy around the world, securing the trade routes for American businesses, American consumers. That's what gave us the ability to become the world's most powerful nation economically and thus militarily. And all that would go away eventually if we allow China to dominate that region, and it starts with Taiwan.
Yeah. So how do we move from diagnosis to prescription? So we know that Taiwan matters, that it is kind of the cork in the genie bottle and also a lot of people, if you haven't looked at the topography of the Pacific Ocean, just to the ocean or American side of Taiwan is a tremendous shelf that drops off into deep water ocean. And on the other side of it is more shallow and choppier waters. So strategically, it is actually very, very important if you're going to project naval power to get into those deep waters.
Absolutely.
And
I have that map in the book that shows the deepness of the waters. It's about 300 feet deep in the Taiwan Strait, too shallow to even put a submarine in there. On the other side, it drops to 12,000, right? The Pacific Ocean, of course, is
really
the deepest
remarkable.
point, yeah, in the world. So imagine China being able to put their submarines on the eastern side of the Taiwan island, right? And
Yeah.
the projection power that they would have, put down sensors in that region, it would make instantly that whole region unsafe for the U.S. Navy. And what does that mean? I don't necessarily see it as Chinese continuing sort of to invade Japan or the Philippines after that. Look, invading Japan would have been very, very difficult for us in 1945. I think it's basically impossible for anyone to invade Japan today. That's not going to happen. But they don't need to invade those countries to dominate that region and to set the rules of the game. Just look at what's happening with Russia's near abroad. Let's say in Central Asia with Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, or in the Caucasus with Armenia. All of these countries are within Russia's sphere of influence, but they don't want to be, right? They would prefer nothing more than to have an independent policy where they could decide what to do for themselves. But by and large, when Russia says jump, they ask how high, because they have no other choice. Because Russia is very powerful, they don't want to see happen to them what happened in Ukraine, and America is far away. We don't have the influence in that region or the interest, quite frankly, to be able to help them if something does happen.
Yeah.
When Georgia was invaded, we really did nothing for them. And as a result, they have to accommodate Russia and do what Russia wants, by and large. Not in every situation, but by and large. That's what's going to happen in that region with Japan, with the Philippines, with Korea. It doesn't mean that they're going to abandon their defense treaties with us, or they're going to do everything that China wants. But this is not a hypothetical. I've had senior government officials in Japan and other countries tell me that if Taiwan falls to China, regardless of how it happens, whether it's because it falls without a fight or we fight for it and we lose, but they will immediately consider that they now have a new sheriff in town
Yeah.
that they need to accommodate and try to appease, because America is going to become irrelevant in that region. And they're going to set the rules of the road, security rules, trade rules. They're going to dominate that region in a way that I think is an existential threat to us, because, again, the importance of that region, and they're not going to stop there. I think dominating Asia leads to domination of the world in terms of, again, projection of power and economic power. And that's what we would face with China. So they will eventually come. I mean, they already are in our hemisphere in the Caribbean and Latin America, but that would expand, tenfold if they are able to dominate Asia.
Well, at the very, very least, I would estimate that at least 50% of global shipping of product goes through or around Taiwan, go through the Taiwan Strait or around the ocean side of it. And if China were to occupy that and project into the Pacific, we have very sizable economies like Japan and Korea who have fundamentally different supply chains as a result of that, and so would we. But let's talk as we sort of get to a finish line. Let's end with the good news, especially the non-military things, or things that people would consider non-military, as in not shooting missiles or developing new weapon systems or whatever else. But what are the other things that we have the capability to do, if we so choose, that would allow us to be in a position where we've done enough right that China's options are just so unfavorable that it makes this kind of a conflict less likely and this kind of a competition more in our favor?
Well, look, Steve, believe it or not, this is actually a very optimistic book. You may not tell it from the title, World on the Brink, and I do warn about the dangers, but I also argue that we have every advantage over China. Their economy, I believe, is in strategic decline because they've reached middle income trap, because of the problems that they're facing with the structure of their economy, the corruption, the centralized control, the clampdown on innovation, but also because of the population collapse that is coming. It has already begun, but is going to be experienced in their economy over the coming decade. So they will probably never reach the size of the U.S. economy, right? Their growth rate is already at about 3%, more or less close to ours, and they're, of course, a much smaller economy. So if that continues, they're doomed in terms of ever becoming as rich and powerful economically as us. They also, as I mentioned, are physically contained from a power projection perspective. Their military is also very weak. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't take Taiwan or they can't successfully fight us for Taiwan, but they don't have the military that we do that is designed to fight any war with any adversary at any point in the globe, right? Imagine us fighting a naval conflict with China in the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it would be a cakewalk, right? They couldn't project any power or logistics in that region. We can't, right? Imagine fighting a land war in Europe with China. I mean, it would be a total disaster for them, right? They've built a very specific capability, and it's a very potent capability to fight in their own backyard and to try to occupy Taiwan, which, by the way, is a very, very difficult mission, one of the most difficult probably in the world. So it's not a certainty that they can even do it. But that's what they've been preparing for, that singular mission for the last 40 years, while we've been distracted with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and, the conflict in Ukraine and everything else that we've been doing, without the focus that we needed to have on the Indo-Pacific. So we've got those advantages. We've got to mobilize them. We've got an incredible innovation base. We've got incredible talent in this country. We've got an incredible network of alliances, whether you look at NATO, whether you look at AUKUS with Australia and Britain. China has none of that, right? It doesn't have a single ally that it can rely on. Even China is not an ally, and it's a very transactional relationship. North Korea is not an ally. It wants to keep balking them and reorient towards Russia, right? So it has no friends in the world, and its economy is getting weaker. Its military is not as strong. So it's really about mobilizing the strengths that we have, our innovation, our military, reforming our defense industrial base, punishing China for the unfair trade practices that they're engaging in, the theft of intellectual property, the subsidies to their industries, the overcapacity and the dumping that they're engaging in, and destruction of our industries. If we mobilize those strengths, we can absolutely deter war and beat China in this Cold War and win the race for the 21st century. It is up to us. The only question is, do we have the will?
I completely agree. And I think it has the added value of advocating for something that matters to me, I suspect you and a lot of others. Get Americans to fall back in love with America again. There's a lot to believe in. There's a lot of good in who we are. We don't have to be perfect to be good. But there's forces out there in the world that are a lot worse if we won't get our act together. So I strongly commend the work that you've done. Before we do the outro, why don't you tell us again the title of the book and where folks can go to get a copy?
World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. It is out now. You can buy it on Amazon, your favorite bookstores. Please consider doing so. And please consider, if you like it, writing a review. If you don't like it, don't bother.
Well, there you have it, folks. If you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends. Consider subscribing and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Dmitri Alperovitch for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.